did some minor studying at Mizzou, so I've taken a few courses there. But most of my recent work comes from about the last 2 years. I recently started working with black and white acrylics, and that's mainly what I do. And a lot of the pieces that I've been working on for my friends or any other customers, a lot of the custom pieces or commission pieces have been a lot of pet portraits and human portraits. So I just wanted to talk about my process, being self-taught and running into a lot of the pitfalls that make your project go out of hand as far as how much time you're being put into it. This problem arose for me specifically from quoting people on the time frame that I thought it would take. So when somebody asks me if I could do a piece for them, I'll tell them how long I think it will go, and then I usually stick to that as my quote. So inherently, I'll have problems with the eyes, or I'll have to do a lot of redos, and any of these overhauls and redundancies are the things that I've tried to eliminate. So what I wanted to focus on today was making things more efficient, or keeping your projects on track if you do have a deadline. And even if you're not doing portraits or realisms per se, hopefully something that I suggest today kind of sparks something that can help you streamline anything else. Trying to make things quicker and not redoing stuff. So I basically break down my process when I'm doing a black and white acrylic portrait into about three phases. So first, I'll do sketching. And the sketching and planning has a lot to do with proportions and reference points, and those are really important. And the second part is basically just painting and filling coverage. And then the third part is basically just refinement. And I found that if I stick to these as phrases, I don't find myself backtracking nearly as much. So if I can set myself in stone and make those decisions happen in phrasings, then I can keep on track a whole lot better. So the first thing I usually like to do with sketching is if you have a reference picture, or if you're doing something in something's likeness and not by memory or hypothetically, if you have that reference picture, it's not a bad idea to use a grid or find reference points on it. So if you have a printout and you want to do 16 inches by 16 inches and then proportionately blow it out that way and do a grid, that's the best way for your realism to not get out of control. Because a lot of the problems that I'll have is when I start like from an eye down here, by the time I get to the mouth, if it's just a little bit off, and it doesn't take much for a face to look unnatural. So a lot of the times having those precise reference points has helped me out a whole lot when I'm trying to, if I find myself replacing the mouth over and over and over again, I found if I put it on a reference or a grid, it helps out a lot. So usually I just find my planning and my proportions. So if you want to do a grid work, you can. It's not very smart.
No, it's not.
It's not. So the first thing I usually do is have my layout or my design options. And a lot of times a grid works well with that. Sometimes you can just do a 4-point reference, and then you can just have that square and basically make that as your reference point. But having some sort of frame of reference for proportions is essential for a face, in my opinion. So after I've decided a way how I'm going to lay stuff out, another technique that I do is for head-on portraits, there's an equilateral triangle. And I'm sure a lot of you, if you study proportions and human anatomy and stuff, between the pinpoints of your pupil and your eyes and then the opening of your mouth is usually proportioned in an equilateral triangle. So a lot of times I can just take this triangle and have that as my start for each points of the eyes and then the middle of the mouth. And then usually, based on there, like I said, anchor points and reference points are paramount as far as not going back and redoing stuff. So after I found a frame of reference for my actual layout, so because I want the whole design on it so it's not out of place, especially if you have to center stuff, I'll have my reference points ready, and then I'll usually start with something detailed and work my way out from that. So after I've set my grid and my reference points, I'll usually start with like an eye and do a lot of the details with the eye, and then do things based off of that. Once again, reference points relative to what you've already done. So if I'm working on the corner of the eye, and then I look at the side of the nostril, every time I'm placing that side of the nostril, I'll look how is it proportionate to here, and then I can do it how is it proportionate to here. And if I look at maybe 4 or 5 different reference points to something else, it'll calibrate it exactly where it's supposed to be. So not only trying to find where is it relating to the corner of the eye and the corner of the nostril, where's the corner of this side of the eye, the bottom of the ear, and everything else, and averaging out all of those and double checking it against everything else, usually I'll find that one point. But it's a matter of redundancy again. Do you have a
Are
question?
all three sides equal?
Yes, it's an equilateral triangle. Unless you have somebody that has a abnormally long face or anything. It's also good for knowing the sides of the nose too, because a wider or larger nose would be a little bit past it, but usually about in between there, the nose will sit right on the sides of these triangles. Once again, it's also something as a frame of reference. If you put it over your original reference picture and look how it relates to what you've actually put on here, like I said, the more times you check it against where it is in the drawing versus other things that are later on added. So after I get a lot of the designs and the eyes and the nose, it's also important not to go too far out of it because a lot of your sketching is going to be covered up by a lot of paint. So you need to figure out which of these lines are absolutely more important. So as you'll see, there's a lot of different sketch lines of me getting the contour of the side of the face. And then when I feel like I have it pretty close to where it is, I usually take a different color pencil and put that as like, that's where I feel like it is supposed to be there. And these are my hard lines. So whenever I do my sketching, these are the lines that I know that I'm going to come back to. And these are absolutes. And this is kind of where I want to start for my different tones. So on my reference picture, this is a Jimi Hendrix portrait. So I usually focus on the things that I know I'm going to color in black. So when I have pupils and different lines in the eyes and underneath the eyelids, a lot of these I'll sketch out absolutely, and then other things like different cheek marks or anything like that, or how concave the eye is, I worry about that later. Because once I get to my coverage phase, I want to start covering the entire canvas and then working from there. My style is I usually like to go like low definition to high definition, so wider brush strokes to finer brush strokes. And I find that I redo things a lot less if I do this kind of sharpening and kind of scoping in on the definition and making it more refined as I go. So after I've got my sketch out, I'll make sure that I have a lot of my hard lines, the lines that I know I want solid. And then I'll also think about things like the nostrils and the pupils and the slit of the mouth. And I usually start with those, and those are the only high contrast things I'll do first. Because when I start going into the second phase and I do my coverage part, I'm really going to start thinking about all of my blacks and whites from a scale of 1 to 100, let's say. So if you've got 1 over here and 100 over here, when I start doing my paint in my coverage phase, besides the pupils and the nostrils and like the slit of the mouth, because again, those are anchor points that I want to stay. After I've committed those in my sketch phase, I want those to be the same when I actually do paint. And a lot of times you're covering up your reference lines, so you want those to be solid and dark and not easy to cover up as you go. Because the second you move an eye just a little bit because you painted over the side of it, and then you correct it over on this side, now you've got somebody that's kind of cross-eyed because those tiny little subtleties in a face, they show up really, really prominently. So after I've got my main points and main outside lines that I want to do, I want to probably stay within a small range of contrast when I'm filling everything out. So that way, later on, if I wanted to go to a wider white or a darker black, that's when it starts getting into the definition and the 3D scope of things. So if I want things to be more defined later on, I'm going to use my whiter whites and blacker blacks. So a lot of times, if I don't want to kind of paint my background around every single tiny little hair, I want the background to be painted before I do every single tiny little hair, if that makes sense. Instead of trying to do an outline on a texture or something very fine, then you're doing a whole lot of extra detail work that you could have just had a black, like complete coverage, and then the swoops on top of it. So this is another reason why I stay within these ranges. So I have kind of a low definition to high definition as I'm working on stuff. So the idea of the second phase is actually to have paint on everything before you start really refining things, which can be tricky because you want these main reference sketch points to be exactly where you sketched them. So a lot of times when I'm doing this, I'll make sure that I get everything done. And then, like I said, you'll have the only black that you really want to start are those anchor points. So pupils, nostrils, and mouth is where I usually like to start. So after I get this, I'll have a darker gray for the hair, a really dark for this, and use like maybe a lighter gray for the face. And then I'll have everything covered. That's the idea that I want at the end, is everything's covered, but in kind of more of a phase where it'll look like this. So this is kind of my mid-phrase where I do a lot of diluting for my grays and blacks so that
Could you, when you show painting, could you bring
Yeah.
it more over here?
The camera? Yeah.
The camera, thank you.
So this one is probably at the end of my coverage phase. So what I've got definition in my eyes and eyebrows and maybe a mustache or the deeper part of the hand, but for the most part I didn't go too deep until I wanted to go into my refinement phase at the end. So I keep everything kind of in my grays so that if I want them to pop or maybe more refined at the end, I have that room to work with. So I've got everything covered, even from like the whites of the eyes to where everything is kind of in my mid-grays. Same with this one over here, where if I did want to do a deeper black for pupils or underneath the shells and stuff like that, I can round it out and make it kind of zoom in even further, so to speak. So this is kind of where, yeah.
Is there any formula? Now he's looking at an angle.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the other picture, you were talking about the triangle having all equal sides. Is there any formula for where those eyes and the mouth is located at an angle?
It is a lot of basically kind of feeling it out. But for this one, what you really want to do is focus on the center of the pupils and make sure that they're even as far as where they're looking based on how much white is on either side. So you can still have the reference point of the middle of the eye socket, so to speak, and then basically base it around there. But as far as formula to make it exact, it's much like how if you have a circular face and you tilt it and you're doing the sketch and you have the rounded line and then you have a rounded line and that's kind of your crux, but it's kind of bent around it. So it really is kind of an intuition thing unless you're absolutely dead straight on. Once again, it's just another form of reference where if I feel like it's a little bit too further down and hypothetically it should be kind of equidistant, it is kind of a feel-out thing. Yep.
Maybe part of an answer to him is that if you were to cut an equilateral triangle out of a piece of cardboard, say, and then tilt it.
That's a great idea.
To the angle, you would probably see what proportion you were.
Right. Right.
And the same would be for between the eyes and the mouth is the hill is tilted also.
Right.
You can probably do that.
Right. That's a great point too. Is if you have a 3D triangle and you kind of hold it at that, you can see how it's going to be proportionally laid out.
Yeah, you can cut a 45-degree triangle and then basically put on your painting to see where the points are. You don't really have to do anything. You just set it on there and turn your triangle to see how they're just suited.
Yeah.
Yep.
Have you always done black and white?
Black and white is what I've been really getting used to over the last couple of years. Anytime I introduce color, I always mess up my timeline as far as deadlines, and getting more efficient with color matching and stuff is something that I haven't gotten into yet. So when it comes to my efficiencies, I do much better with the black and white.
Good reason to join Northside.
There we go. Yeah. Like I said, I'm always trying to improve, and the thing that kind of made me want to talk about portraits and everything, because this is probably one of my weakest areas about a year ago. And one of my favorite things about paintings, especially individual paintings, is I like taking my worst one and making it my favorite one. So in my worst technique, trying to make it my favorite technique is what I've been doing over about the last year. So with different pet portraits and human portraits, I'm trying to just give my 2 cents of what I think can cut down your troubleshooting or the things that you run into that kind of make it a roadblock or a writer's block, so to speak. So with this one, I'm kind of within this frame where I can go lighter and darker to make these different highlights. And I also feel like I've got everything nice and proportionalized, so I'll start working with thinner brushes, much more detail, and also more of a contrast. So I'll start adding the highs and the lows. And a lot of these will come into play like tiny little dots in the eyes. I save a lot of my whitest whites for my light source. So if I have something coming in, I want it to kind of feel like it is always coming from over here, kind of with the top of the chin, on the tip of the nose and stuff like that. But because I left myself that room in my coverage portion, I can add those little highlights later on. So if I want his hairline to be a little bit more precise, I can take a darker dark and feather this out and make the roots kind of stand and pop. So it kind of draws your eyes into this line that this is the hairline. It's not a jumbling of random different gradations of gray in his hair. Kind of had it gray, and then I've got a whole bunch of lights that shows my light source of where it hits his hair, and I've got darks where I can show where it's deeper in or more shadowy or should be more of a contour. So this would be a good example of where I go with my refinement phase and my third phase. And that usually, like I said, has to do with widening that contrast. Leaving myself that room in the second phase is where I can get more definition in my third phase. So, and with that,
So you don't consider any of those finished?
I would consider this one finished, and this one is pretty close to finish. Like I said, I could still do a little bit more with the light source, adding a little bit on the pupil, or maybe even more contrast in the hair to give it more of a 3D feel, because you can deepen it and make it, like I said, a lot of the contrast and the 3D shaping comes from that third phase. It might seem a lot flatter when I do this, but if I add the dark blacks and even just hint it on the outside of the hair, and maybe right here in the hairline, it'll deepen everything and it kind of sits in. So if you're thinking about it three-dimensionally, it's like if you're adding on clay to make things come at you a little bit further. And that's how I use my contrast.
So do you just use black and white and you mix all the different grades from those two colors?
Usually. A lot of times I'll do one at a time, and I'll start thinking about like the certain gray that I use for his face, I'll try to use for his hand or any other skin spots. Fabrics, I'll try to keep that same color and apply it to everywhere else where I can. Basically just hitting one shade at a time within that small region is what I usually try to do. And I apply that until it's covered. Like I said, breaking them up into phases helps me keep on task. So when I'm not resketching an outside thing after I've already painted half the face, it kind of keeps me on task as far as my phases. So I'd like to sketch everything out and then paint and have everything covered, but I always keep it within that window so I can sharpen things later. And also, after you get the coverage done, like I said, with the dark pupils and the dark nostrils and stuff, you always want to double check your proportions when you get the refinement phase. Another cool thing about that too is, for example, if I'm not happy with the way the hand sits, like I feel like the tips of his fingers might be a little bit too fat, because I left things in this region. It's basically, I have the option of maybe putting darker gray on this, which makes the fingers seem a little bit thinner. Slowly do stuff like this, and I kind of have thinned this out. And conversely, if I wanted this to not be thinner but fatten it out, I can just add more on this side. So because I've left myself in this region, changing the size of something or the contour of my hard lines that I tried to define earlier, if I'm a little bit off, all I need to do is go a little bit lighter or a little bit darker and make it where it was supposed to be. I don't have a lot of my pet portraits here, but I brought this one. It's an Ewok. But it does have a lot of the textures that you would see for cat hair or dog hair or short-haired animals. So a lot of the things I would do with this, and this is another good example of my coverage phase to the refinement phase, where I've got dark blacks basically everywhere, and I use the large shape and large style grays just to fill everything in, and then slowly made things pop out so you can see the three-dimension of the elbow comes out once the light source is added on the refinement. So when I add like the little white highlights and dark black highlights, all of the contour and the depth of it starts coming out. So
Is that acrylic or?
this is acrylic, yeah.
Would you mind passing that
No,
around?
not at all. And I do a lot of water cutting with my acrylic, especially if I want the line underneath it to shine through. I will add a whole lot of water, and it does act like more of a watercolor, and it gets a little bit more smudgy, but I enjoy doing that for, once again, the refinement process. Not everything is as kind of hard-lined as all of these. You can see there's some thumb smudging, and little bits that I do, but once again, it's just all a matter of taste. And when it comes to the refinement process, I found that the best thing for you to do is leave yourself space. So if you want things to pop or shine a little bit more or deepen or be more shapely, you have that option. I found that if I'm redoing things or something was already dark in the first place, I've got nowhere else to go. So, show a little bit of examples with this. So I'm pretty comfortable with where everything is. For the time's sake, I'm going to start on it, but I would probably have more reference lines for the sides of his jacket. And once again, you don't need to do every single hair per se, but where I want those two colors to kind of overlap or stay, I'll just do a little reference line right in there.
Do you have any brand of paint you like better than others?
These Windsor Nude ones, I usually go shopping at Michael's, and these are kind of the level 2, and they're not the high-end professional ones. I found these have a lot better coverage, but some of the cheaper brands, when I'm doing large scale, because some of the ones I've done where I have a lot of coverage, I don't mind the Craft Smart ones. But a lot of times you can do my coverage phase, the second phase, with the cheaper paints, and then I can do my refinement with the nicer paints. Sometimes that gives me black.
Okay, if I ask you and the other artists a question, I need to know from everybody else, is everybody ever exposed to what is called overworking the piece?
Yeah. All the time.
Okay. How would you know? I mean, I just finished up this certain thing at home that I don't want to do anymore too, but I'm afraid you keep doing more to it that you overwork it.
Stop right before that.
That's what I'm doing.
Stop right before that.
And that's one of the things that I found that I was trying to combat, especially if it was a piece for somebody and it's a deliverable or if it's a gift or if it's a commission piece. I don't want it to get out of hand for my own personal sake that I've invested too much in it, but also finding a stopping point in a portrait is always extremely hard to do.
Yeah, well, there's a section on there that I consider having trouble with. I'm more or less leaving it alone because if I keep adding to it, it might detract from the other parts of it.
Right, right. And that's what I found in my personal experience. I do that to my proportions or my placement of things. If I overwork one eye, I've been working macro for so long, for some reason I've made the eye just slightly smaller, and then when I zoom back out and I look at the whole, then I've messed up the entire proportion of the face.
Okay.
So a lot of my ideas are based on trying to not do that to myself, because those are the pitfalls that I found, especially trying to do portrait work.
Paint some of it, turn it over the side and paint some of the sectors to see how that will look at it. It's obviously the base.
Are you putting your darkest dark in?
I'm sorry?
Is there some white in that, or are you putting your darkest dark?
Well, I'm putting my, like I said earlier, the darkest darks for the pupils and the eye and the nostril and these.
Oh, for your hard line shades?
Hard lines, yeah. Usually I put these in a dark, just so if I accidentally do go over it with something, this is the one that's the hardest to cover up. My blacks usually show through no matter how thick my coverage is for any gray. I'll still be able to see that kind of line where it is.
You know that you're impinging on that.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I have to make sure the machine doesn't come down.
So how do you determine your light source from a certain?
A lot of times it's built into my reference picture, and if not, I use that in the refinement process. It'll be just a matter of balancing the entire composition. If you do have the leeway of choosing where your light source is, it's a really good tool for adding that nice little highlight at the end. If you want it to be more top heavy, or if you want it to seem ominous, you can bottom light it. You can add your own extra little light source later for those tiny little highlights on the high end of your whites. So your whitest whites, if you don't have a light source in the reference, or if you just have to choose it, that's another aesthetic for you to just kind of put a little extra sprinkle on. A lot of times when I'm doing the coverage part of it, I'll try to keep it two-tone. So I usually have like my main skin tone that I've chosen, and then I'll usually maybe do one darker gray than that to do the sides of the face, the sides of the nose, but it's got to be really, really subtle. Like I said, so you can always have room to move it. But I usually like to try to work with the two-tone to start.
And you're saying two tones in addition to your black?
Yes, correct, correct. The only thing that you kind of do deep on the outside of these is those anchor points with the pupils and the nostrils and the mouth. I found that those are crucial to have from the get-go so that you don't smudge it or overlap it or change the proportions too easily.
Do you ever paint black like that and everybody always blend as well? Pretty much. Mm-hmm.
Yes, you're interesting. Yes, you're very interesting. Very nice style.
That's for sure. Oops, I'm sorry.
It's called pop art. I've seen it.
Is that now in my
I think it's supposed to be.
Kind of, for example, right there with the dark mouth shade that I did, that overstroke right there, you can still see exactly kind of where that dark line was. So I'm not going to
verify that, but if you guys want to see the pencil drawing, she's done it for grandchild. Is that right, Grandma?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Picture.
Yeah.
Just great scale. See the different styles. These are, this is more, this is different. We can start moving more forwards. A little bit.
Is that his food?
Sorry. Oh. Attention.
In fact, that looks like somebody did it on software, so you look at the size. It's like the program. That's why I know that from parts of Without what? The tooth go?
Who would Rich fall out?
So do you charge a certain amount per hour, or?
I usually quote it based on the hours.
So you
And
have a set price per hour, and then you figure out how many hours?
yeah, I'll usually keep it around like $15 an hour, or depending on if it's a friend or a stranger, somebody I don't know, but I never let it get too far out of hand based on the hours. I usually always quote within like a 2 to 3 hour ballpark of what I think it'll do. And then even conversely, kind of keeps a cap on when I do get to that point. I have to start finding my ways of finishing it up, which is where most of my ideas came from about keeping things timely, because I wanted to keep with my deadline and my quote. Now I'm going to take this gray tone just a tiny little bit deeper, and make it a little bit darker. I'm going to start using that as my second tone. Usually I like to work a lot more left to right, which I'm sure everybody has a lot of, but for the sake of time, I'm not going to be able to wait for it to dry. Again, once again, it's also revisiting those hard lines in the contour. A lot of times I'll change the shape of this based on how close the eyes are and stuff. So it's a good idea to take a separate color and make your final line in something different, because it's easy to lose track of.
Curtis, I have another reason why you need to join Northside. Ben needs a ride when Ken.
There we go.
Sorry, it's just,
Be happy to.
no, just, don't worry about it, don't worry about it, it's all right, it's all right. I try to get around whenever I
What's his name?
can.
Is that a
Oh,
bigger?
and from the picture on the reference, he's got the ear of a glasses kind of in his lip right there. So he's kind of smiling, and it's kind of like in his lip, like he's like thinking about something, but it's kind of just a little.
Okay. Yes, we were wondering back
Yeah,
there
it's just
what
the
that
arm
was.
of his sunglasses or eyeglasses.
I was too.
Yeah, sorry.
But didn't want to ask.
Now I see the innuendo the entire time. No, but it's one of the famous pictures. I was thinking about something iconic, but also something face on that I could do with the equilateral triangle. And as far as Jimi Hendrix, it's a great for skin tone and contrast. It was a great black and white one, and it was head on, which is the main reason why I chose it. So for the sake of time, I'm going to move on, but try to get as much two-tone coverage as you can before you start dabbling into expanding that contrast. Because the less you can expand that contrast, the more room you'll have later on.
Are you using acrylic?
Yes.
What are you doing to keep it from drying out?
I usually move fast. A lot of times you can add a little bit of water to it. When I'm using my coverage phase, like I said, it doesn't really matter if they're a little bit watered down, because I can actually use that because I can see through whenever I'm doing contours. Like when I overlapped here, I use the dark color so I can still see through it. And the same way, so I can also save my paint and keep it wet, as I'll add a little bit of water as I'm doing the coverage phase.
Right.
But right now I'm working a lot faster than I normally do.
Right, right.
And
Just
then-
have a little water dish and dip your brush into it.
Right?
Also,
Yep. You can also start equating the deeper parts of the face with those deeper grays. So a lot of the corners of your mouth and like underneath the chin, the eye sockets, those are the places, as you get darker, you can think of darker and deeper in the face as far as your contours. So as I get a darker shade, I can start adding these tiny little spots of depth that kind of make things round out as I refine them. So you do the inner parts of the eye socket, tiny little dabs in the corner of the nose. Slowly but surely fill everything in. for the sake of time, I'm going to kind of focus in on this area and parts of the eyes to show some of the refinement spots. Now I've got most of my coverage done. I would like to have the teeth white before I started this next spot, but I just kind of want to show you how I use the deepening of the lighter whites and the darker darks to make things settle in and take shape.
Oh, yeah.
Did you buy that brush that way, or is it just from use to Curtis?
This one actually is from being in here.
Okay.
I've got a lot of the ones that I use normally, especially if they're cheaper brushes. They stay out and then they end up like this. But it's a lot easier to transport these ones and have my whole fold out. But
Yeah.
so, for example, the corner of the mouth is small, where this meets. You can draw a lot of emphasis to that. So in the refinement phase, going darker and deeper at the bottom of the hairs on the mustache, and also on the corner of the mouth. It kind of draws the whole thing together and makes your eye see it as a whole. So when you have things bottom darkened, I found that adding those tiny little emphases gives the entire shape of it. So I usually do, when I'm in my refinement process, I'll do black underneath the hair, and then do the light source usually on top. This is a wonderful example of it, starting with that middle gray and using your outers, blacks and whites, to change it into something completely different.
What color are you going to make the background of that?
I'm probably going to find a lighter gray that is darker than his skin tone, but also I'm going to have black and black right here, so this will be the lightest part. The lightest of the lights will be on his face, and then I'll have a middle gray that is in between kind of these two. And the picture that I have as a reference, he's wearing kind of like a black pea coat with a larger collar. And then of course the black hair, and I think just the nice lower tone gray won't compete with the highlights on his face, also won't be as dark as his hair. They still want the definition of the hair actually come out. So as a rough example, taking the dark gray of his mustache, and that's my base color, and then I'll use the darker darks to kind of give it shadow underneath, and then the lighter lights just to be the highlights on the hairs. Another great refinement process, usually one of the last things I'll ever do is, or for each piece, is light sources on the eyes are a very, very quick, easy touch that just brings life to something. It gives you the texture of a wet, shiny eyeball, and it just brings life to the character itself. And a lot of times that will dictate your light source too. So don't put the light bulb in, or the little eye accent before you pick where you want to put it on the hair and everything else. So if I put it right here, basically I'm saying that all of these will be my light sources. Kind of roughly do it that way. So basically my process is I sketch until I have it complete, especially with my hard lines, the contours of the face, where you place your eye, and the proportion between everything else. I want to do that, have that settled, and then I move on and then I do the coverage, and hypothetically I'd like everything to be covered before I start expanding outside of my contour. And that's basically my process and the things that I've found in trying to get better and more efficient with my portraits. Thank you guys. Any questions or anything?
You could paint another 15 minutes.
Yeah, I was going to keep going, but I didn't want to keep being redundant, but those are the phrases that I've always worked with.
Awesome. So how many of you think Curtis should join us?
Now, if you wanted to correct that, go back in with a white, since it's a darker grays.
Correct, which part?
Let's just say there's an area you need to fix. It's a real dark gray and you're right over the nose.
That's another advantage of having it darker or lighter. Let's say, for instance, I wanted this to be looking a little bit thinner. What I can do is take like a darker gray and put it on the outside right here and kind of trim it in. I'm not really...
No, I'm saying that gray, let's say it is gray and it's cheap right here. You didn't want that gray.
If I wanted it to be a lighter or a darker gray, you mean?
Yeah.
I'd probably just go over it.
Go over it?
Mm-hmm. But a lot of times, like I said, if I've got it diluted with a little bit of water, I'm not going over my sketch lines, and that's another way too I can kind of match my grays. I'm going to kind of have a test swatch of a watered down version, and then take whatever proportion I made for that watered down version and add more white or more black, because it'll reduce how much water's in it proportionately, and it'll make it darker or lighter, depending on what I want to do.
Okay.
So I would most likely do 2 phases of that coverage. I usually do it in 2 phases just so I can get it right.
I'm referring to, let's say you made a mistake, you go back and you would fix it, let's say it was dark gray, go back with the white and fix it.
I wouldn't go back with a white. I'd probably use another variation of the gray,
Okay,
just trying to stay in it.
all right.
Well, while Curtis is painting a little bit more, would you like to know who won the monthly competition?
Yes.
Awesome. I heard 2 people say yes, so you 2 just come out here with me, and I'll tell you. How many of you would like to know the results of the monthly competition?
Yes.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, then I'll do it in here. All right. So, in 4th place, getting 5 points, is number 8, which is Ready for Winter by Nora Schmoke, acrylic. And in place and getting 10 points towards the yearly competition is number 20 by Joyce Latham. Beautiful.
They're all beautiful.
They're all beautiful. I gotta say, and I tell this to everybody, Northside has some of the most talented artists in the St. Louis area. I mean, we've got a wealth of experience and a wealth of wonderful painters and photographers and, it's gorgeous. We had some gorgeous work. So gorgeous that we tied for second place. So in no particular order, for second place, both will receive 15 points. Number 7, Geisha Girl. Geisha Girl. Geisha Girl, number 7. Done Dellerman, which is acrylic watercolor. Beautiful. Beautiful, beautiful. And also tied for second is number 12. The Indian Girl by Michael Stahl. And let's see. Before I announce first place, I'll just go through and show off everybody else's work and make the competition last a little longer, huh?
Oh my goodness. She's being cruel.
I know. This one's by Chris Fisher. It's called A Delicious Treat. That's margarine color pencil. And poor Steve spilled tea on this on his way in, so we opened up the back to let it dry. But it's called No Reservation Photography. Steve Ashley. And this one is Self-Portrait by Jerry Heiser, French board. Self-Portrait? Oh, okay.
Is that a scratch board?
Scratch board. This one is by Lou Heiser, Barn Raising in watercolor. Lilac Visitors by D. Dellerman and Oil. And this one is by Ben Underwood. The Modern Saloon. I'm trying to read handwriting. Modern Saloon in acrylic. Wonderful, Ben.
Ben, is it open?
Yeah.
Joy, have we not?
And this one here is by Judy Rucky, Prague Square in watercolor. Notice I haven't said what's won first,
I know.
because I'm going to go back after I've shown everybody's. Because I'm so mean. This one's by Jim Bennett, The Airplane in Ink.
Stickle is, you take a pen and you want to shade it and you make 1,000 dots.
Wow.
And if you
A lot
want
of
darker,
dots.
you just keep going.
This one is the Black and White Motorcycle by Jim Bennett and ink with some color. Okay. So, first place this month is it was number 17. probably Steve Ashley. He said he's got 30 points going into tonight. So nobody, Michael Stahl might have overtaken him, and Joyce Latham. So, and Judy already had 10 points going into tonight. So those look like our contenders to start catching up to. We have to be out of here by 9, so we got 20 minutes. So if you guys want to stay and watch Curtis paint for a few more minutes, and then he'll need some time to clean up and get out of here.
I'm glad you're doing that, Curtis. Because I wanted to see your piece was, yeah.
Closest that I know of is like
Times Square was the name of it, but you didn't always do the name. Oh, did you do that?
Go straight up to your floor.
I'm probably not going to go out tonight. If you guys want to go out tonight, I'd try Steak and Shake. There's a Steak and Shake up on Lindbergh and
Straight up to your floor.
Make a left out into the parking lot.
Uh-huh.
Or if you're up for outside, like you said, Doodle. Doodle? But they don't do that. There's not indoor.
They're not as good as
There's Walmart.
Yeah, I think they're still open at
I
10.
think they close at 10:30.
Well, and then the other place.
You're not doing this for anyone, Curtis. This was just for demo
Yeah, this
purposes.
was just for demo purposes. When I looked over what would be easiest to show or demonstrate in a short amount of time,
Yeah.
the straight-on equal
You
triangle, I
did
think is
really good.
Thank you. I felt like that was a good technique to try and illustrate this. Because reference points and finding anchors in your visual are the primary basis of everything that I try to do. When it comes to trying to be meticulous or get my process to stay on track, always referring back to reference points is my biggest thing.
I've never tried
That's your kids.
I've never tried portraits.
They're hard. I think that was what inspired me to try to tackle this concept as far as a presentation, because it was the hardest thing for me to tackle.
Yeah.
And I think another cool thing to always carry is when you have multiple projects going, I like to make my least favorite my favorite. It's one of my favorite things to do, and I'm just like, that one is not good at all. And I was like, you know what? I have 3 hours to spend. I'm going to make this one good, and not just not good. And then maybe someday it'll get great, and then usually my least favorites become my favorites.
Yeah. When I mess up, though, I don't know how to correct it. That's the hard part.
Right.
Talking about, I don't know when to quit.
Right. And that's why.
Especially if it's really going good. I just
Yeah. Exactly. Which is, that's very, very common, but also with my work that I've done, trying to have deliverables and getting them off my plate, is finding a place for you as an artist to be, okay, I'm done with this. Because like you said, you can always just go and refine it, or try something new with it, but it's a good way to try and go from point A to point B.
Oh, yeah.
I feel like breaking it down into phases helps me do that.
Yeah.
I'll call you for sure about Friday. When do you have a dental appointment?
So can you do that?
Wednesday.